History is 90% tea with a little bit of spy stuff thrown in. So today I'm going to tell you a story about how a president's stupidity and hubris were his own downfall. Because we can only hope, right? If you haven't seen my Watergate video, I do recommend it because it provides some good context. Also, just a quick reminder that our favorite vertical app is still slated to go away in January, so please consider finding me elsewhere. You may have heard mention of the Nixon tapes before, and they are definitely related to Watergate very heavily, but they kind of are their own thing because Nixon was messy. So the important things to remember about Watergate were there was first the crime, then there's the cover-up, and then there's the cover-up of the cover-up, where Nixon was like, I gotta get rid of all the people involved in this so that if they're caught, they were caught. I don't get caught too. Foolproof plan, right? The only problem is you have to have a lot of trust. So all the Watergate stuff is going down and all the people kind of around Nixon are currently being investigated and they're trying to figure out what to do. So there's one guy on Nixon's team, this guy named John Dean, is like, listen, we should all speak to prosecutors and give them like the best version of events that protects Nixon. Let's just fall on our sword, so to speak, and protect dear leader. He's still under the impression that Nixon had almost nothing to do with the original crime. He was just involved in the cover-ups that he has been facilitating until he goes to have a meeting with Nixon in Nixon's office. In this meeting, seemingly out of nowhere, Nixon starts going like, so, remember that joke? That joke I told you where I was like, hey, you should pay the burglars hush money as a joke. Do you remember that joke? Wasn't it funny? Because you remember it was a joke, right? John Dean is like, Then Nixon gets up from his chair, walks to a totally different corner of the room and starts whispering. And he's like, yeah, I probably shouldn't have done those hush money payment things, huh? That probably wasn't good. Which John Dean is like, yeah, that was obstruction of justice. That was definitely a crime. And it's at that moment that John Dean thinks to himself, I'm being recorded. And he was not wrong. So the thing about Nixon is that he bugged the bejesus out of his office. He had microphones like everywhere. Now, it's not uncommon for presidents to have recorded. In fact, every president did some form of recording starting in 1940. But Nixon's level of recording was unprecedented. Something also kind of interesting is that when he first took office, he removed all of the recording equipment that was in place before. What were you hiding, Dick Nixon? A couple years into his term, though, like he and his chief of staff, Haldeman, decide like, you know what? Maybe it's not such a bad idea to have microphones set up. So they end up setting up this like state-of-the-art system with multiple microphones in the Oval Office and a bunch of other offices that he would work out of, as well as recording the phone lines. And the system was so advanced at the time that it was voice activated. No one had to flip a switch and turn it on or choose to record it. Interestingly, eventually the recording system at Aspen Lodge was actually switched to a like switch method, so it wasn't voice activated. And I'm sorry, but like, why? You know? So basically this whole recording system is installed and almost no one knows about it. And that's when super loyal John Dean is like, I gotta get ahead of this. Because that's when John Dean realizes he's basically being set up. He has committed a lot of crimes for the president. He still thinks that the president was totally innocent of the whole like original thing and just kind of got caught up in this like cover up. And it turns out he's been recording this the whole time and he's trying to get me to admit on tape that he's totally innocent. Nuh-uh. So he decides to tell investigators and Congress everything he knows. He writes up a whole statement. And at the end of the statement, he's like, listen, I know it's my word against the president's, and I don't know if there's a tape, but I'm pretty sure there's a tape. And I'm just saying, if there is, you're going to want to check the tape. Which, by the way, very much gave the same energy as former head of the FBI, James Comey, testifying about Trump when he was like, I hope there are tapes. So as soon as the Senate hears this, they're like, oh, a tape, you say? And they call up Butterfield for a chat. In this chat, they're like, so about these tapes. And Butterfield like freezes. And he's like, I didn't know you knew about those. Rose. And they're like, we didn't. Thank you so much for confirming, though. Here's a subpoena. So now Nixon and everyone around him are in panic mode. The special prosecutor is like, give me the tapes. They're like, no, executive privilege. And he's like, no, seriously, give me the tapes. The courts are like, yeah, you can't do executive privilege here. You gotta hand them over. This is when Nixon, who is a messy bitch, offers the Stennis compromise. He's like, listen, why don't we prepare the transcripts, and then Senator John Stennis can sit and listen to the tapes with the transcripts, and then he can report to you and paraphrase what's in the tapes, which is like sketchy enough on its own, but it's so much worse when you learn that John Stennis was partially deaf and just months earlier had been mugged and was still hopped up on a bunch of medication. So the guy was completely out of it. Unsurprisingly, the prosecutor is like, no. And then the special prosecutor and just about everyone else in the government goes home for the weekend, thinking that they can return to this on Monday. The very next day is what is now known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Around this time, supposedly, there's also transcripts being made of the tapes by Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods. And it's around this time that she claims that she has made a terrible mistake and erased part of one of the tapes. Something you should know about Rosemary Woods, by the way, is that she and Nixon are like the OG work wife and husband. They are besties. They are inseparable. She would take a bullet for the man. She had been profiled in magazines and was well known because they were so close at this point. Now Rosemary is claiming that while she was transcribing one of the tapes, she accidentally erased a portion of a conversation that occurred just 3 days after the Watergate break-in between Nixon and his right-hand man, Haldeman. What a coincidence. The way she says this happened is also very interesting. See, the way she was transcribing these tapes involved a machine with a foot pedal that would basically allow her to scrub through the tape while typing everything that was on it. While she was transcribing, she claimed she received a phone call, and when she went to hit stop on the tape player, she accidentally hit record. And then while she was on the phone call for several minutes, she kept her foot on the pedal, scrubbing forward. This in and of itself is kind of an odd mistake, especially for a woman that Nixon himself had been quoted on numerous occasions calling like infallible and absolutely perfect in every way. But it gets a little weirder when you actually see the position she had to be in to answer the phone and keep her foot on the pedal. This became known as the Rosemary stretch. Another complication is the fact that she claims that the phone call she took lasted around 5 minutes, but the total gap on the tape was 18 and a half minutes long. Yeah. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of theories about what might have happened here and who might have erased it. Years later, Chief of Staff Haig suggested that maybe it was Nixon because he was such a blumbering fool with technology. Sometime after that, he suggested that maybe it was just an unidentified sinister force. A lot of people think it might have just been Haig. Nixon, of course, was outraged. Eventually, a panel was appointed to investigate this. They determined that, number one, the buzzing that was heard on the tape was of no consequence. Number two, they determined that the gap was, in fact, an erasure. Number three, they determined that it occurred in at least 5 separate segments, possibly as many as 9. And 4, that at least 5 segments had to have been hand operated. That is, they could not have been caused by the foot pedal. As to who was responsible or why, they came up empty. Naturally, these 18 and a half missing minutes are pretty legendary. There are so many theories about what possibly could be on them. They show up in popular culture all the time. The tape is currently being held in a climate-controlled room just in case the technology one day develops to retrieve whatever that audio was, because you gotta wonder. Because there are so many hours of audio, only a tiny percentage of the tapes has been released, most of which I can't actually repeat here. Let's just say that he lacked particular affinity for certain groups of people. He was also super paranoid, which, like, as a super criminal, why wouldn't you be? When the Pentagon Papers were leaked and then released, he was convinced that they were going to come after him too. So he created a counter conspiracy involving these guys he called the plumbers because they plugged leaks. And when they found out that a military analyst had released the Pentagon Papers, they broke into his psychiatrist's office to see what they could find to use against him. There's also audio of him instructing someone to break into the Brookings Institution because he thought that they had information about his illegal attempts to sabotage peace talks that were going to bring about the end of the Vietnam War when he was not president, in the hopes that it would help him win the presidency. Sound familiar? Part of the reason that he wanted his cronies to steal this imaginary report, which didn't actually exist, by the way, was because he wanted to, quote, blackmail Lyndon B. Johnson. He also talks a lot of trash about JFK and just the Kennedys in general because he was apparently very jealous of how popular JFK was. If you want to look through any of these recordings or transcripts, most if not all of them are available online. The Watergate transcripts are pretty fun to kind of just like flip through because even though there's hundreds if not thousands of pages of them, any page you land on is just crime. Just crime. Crime, cover up, talking about crime and cover up. Just wild. But again, I for one absolutely believe in documentation.